Sure. Yes, because the other day I did not. Yep, I think it's on. That's it. All right, thank you. You want to give me a little clue when they're out of the lobby? I just got a thumbs up, so that means we're ready to go. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Tinney. I serve as the Chancellor here at Nunez Community College, and we are delighted to host you this evening for our History Lecture Series that will kick off this year's series of historical lectures that are relevant topics to our college community at large. We are delighted to have you join us tonight, and we're always looking for some feedback as well. So we have an email list. If you have not signed up, be sure to do so that you can get information regarding the topics and the dates of each of the lecture series. And for tonight, you are in for a very special treat. If you have come onto our campus, I hope you've noticed that we have spent a good deal of time and money and resources in investing in really expanding our campus so that it meets the needs of our students and our community. I was delighted this evening as I was coming into the auditorium, and I saw a few folks that looked to me like a date night, and they were enjoying our Voyage mark that is erected outside. So if you have missed that, we are only one of 14 sites across the country who have an outdoor walking exhibit of the entire solar system to scale. So please come back if you haven't had the opportunity to see our stanchions and experience that. We invite you to do so, as well as the other investments here in the building. We are still working in our library. The second floor hosts our SOFAB museum. And so that's the Southern Food and Beverage Archive. If you haven't experienced that, we invite you to do so. We are continuing to work on our Slanio archive, and so that is a labor of love and a legacy project that we are watching evolve, and happy to say that we are on track toward a ribbon cutting there. And we also, if you haven't noticed, as you leave this evening, we have a fresh market, which has a variety of foods for our students, community, to go in and enjoy. So we've envisioned this college to be a destination in learning. And this is one aspect tonight that we host our community so that you can have an enlightening and an entertaining series and experience here at our college. Assisting with our history lecture series is Mr. William Hyland, who serves as the historian of St. Bernard Parish and the director of the Los Isleños Museum Complex. He's an incredible historian and an advocate for our parish. Mr. Hyland has dedicated his life to educating people about the importance of St. Bernard Parish in the overall landscape of southeast Louisiana. He has been instrumental in support of this series of our college as a whole, and an integral part of developing the Isleño Archive initiative in our library. We are grateful to have him with us this evening to share information on the life and legacy of Sammy Nunez and his wife, for whom this institution is named, Elaine Potter Nunez. This is a perfect kickoff to the series. If you were outside, you've also noticed our banners that are celebrating 30 years of service to our students in our community at Nunez Community College. And so please join me in a warm welcome to Mr. Hyland to share insights to Mr. Sammy Nunez and his wife, Elaine.
Thank you, dear. You're so good. You know, Tina has infinite patience. She puts up with me all the time. So, and particularly Sammy was always a great good friend of mine also. So, you know, I remember before Katrina, I had occasion to meet with some people here in St. Bernard. And they said, you know, why is there a community college named for a Nunez? Who are the Nunezes? Well, that person made a big mistake because I'm a Nunez. And he found out who the Nunezes were. But as time has gone on, though, it's become increasingly apparent to me that recent as Sammy's presence and Elaine's presence was in this community, as recent as it was, people are forgetting one of the really titanic, if you will, one of the great leaders, successful leaders in 20th century St. Bernard Parish. If you wanted to know anything in Europe, you go to Europe, you go to Paris, you go to Vienna, talk to OPEC, the oil-producing eastern countries. They knew Sammy Nunez. He represented Louisiana. You go to the French government, they knew Sammy Nunez. Sammy Nunez worked with Adolfo Suarez to help to bring democracy to Spain. I mean, this man was a giant, but unfortunately, you know, a lot of people have forgotten that. And of course, tonight, in a very short presentation, I can't really convey to you all of the importance that Sammy had. And of course, I just thought the world of him. His niece is here, other family members are here tonight. So it's really just great to see so many people. So we'll go now to the next slide. Let me see if I can do this. Let's see. There we go. So, the Nunez de Villavicencio family, that is the name of the family. Nunez de Villavicencio family came from Seville, Spain, Sevilla. And I actually went to the Barrio de Cruz, where the family lived. Unfortunately, they lived on the Calle Genoveses, Street of the Genoese, in the Barrio de la Cruz. It's a part of Seville that dates to the Moorish occupation. And according to research that other cousins of ours have done recently, it would appear that the Nunez family was Sephardic Jewish in origin, and that they converted in the 1400s to Christianity, to Catholicism. So in any event, they were not the great nobility of Spain, but by George, they did have a coat of arms. And so you see it there. And then this particular entry here talks about the attorney, Nunez, who arrived in La Laguna in the 1500s. Actually, he was in La Laguna and in Tenerife in the 1490s, just before the completion of the conquest. And he is the progenitor of our family in the Canary Islands. And it's a huge family. And as a matter of fact, even today, there are Nunezes in Tenerife who are very prominent leaders, political leaders, and business leaders, and it's the same family. You'll also notice that the Nunez family, if you could read this, actually donated money and became patrons of the Church of La Concepcion in La Laguna. La Laguna is where our family lived, and it's a World Heritage Site today. It's absolutely exquisite. And the church that the Nunez family patronized, donated to considerably to help build, is a national landmark in Spain. Let's see, this is not making any sense. So here we see a map of Tenerife. Let's see if I can get this. Well, anyway, at the very top to the right, you see La Laguna. That is the ancient capital of the Canary Islands. It dates to the 1400s. And it's nestled in mountains, and it can be 100 degrees Fahrenheit at the seashore. But that same day, you go to La Laguna, and it's 69 degrees. It's absolutely un paraíso. It's a paradise. It's just beautiful. So let's see now. This is the Church of La Concepcion. The tower is what makes it a national landmark in Spain. And it's built with stone quarried in Tenerife. Wait until you see the next slide. That's the altar. And the Nunez paid in large measure for that altar. So you want to know who our ancestors were? You could see it tonight. And as a matter of fact, we were baptized, married, and buried from that church. And it's just absolutely beautiful. I look forward to the day that all of us can take a trip over there together and we get to see it in person. Now, believe it or not, the Nunezes came here in 1778, and Esteban Nunez, who is our ancestor, he died in 1828, and when he died, he had become a sugar planter. So his plantations were, you see, Widow Nunez and then Widow Nunez. His widow was Sebastiana Delgado. But when he died, he had never learned to read and write, but he was very, very clever, very intelligent, very good businessman. We'll talk about that. Here we see the passenger list from 1778 of the Santissimo Sacramento. And this was the first ship bringing colonists to Louisiana from the Canary Islands. And look who's there. Manuel Nunez Villavicencio, his wife Josefa Suarez. They were married in La Concepcion Church. His daughter Maria del Carmen, she's 12 years old. Maria, daughter 4 years old. Esteban, hijo 7 years old. He's our ancestor. Ignacio and Josefa, they were twins. Now, what happened, unfortunately, when the boat stopped in La Habana, in Havana, Cuba, before coming to Louisiana, he was ill. So he got off the boat with the family, and they remained in Cuba until the next boat came and then brought them, it was a month later, brought them to Louisiana. And then they were settled at a place called Galvez-Town. Galvez Town was named for Bernardo de Galvez. He was governor of Louisiana when the Canary Islanders arrived. And it was the first settlement established, and it was at the confluence of the Amite River and Bayou Montchac. And believe it or not, the other side of Bayou Montchac and the Amite River was West Florida. It was a British colony. A British colony. So where he was settled in, if you will, an international boundary zone. And so he became a farmer there. We don't know when he died. He received his last supplement rations and income from the Spanish government rather, in 1780. So it must have been right around that time that he died. I have not been able to find Manuel Nunez de Villavicencio's death in Louisiana, and I've looked and I'm continuing to look. And of course, there you can see the cutaway with the actual names of the family. So, let's fast forward a bit. At some point in the 1780s, Esteban and Sebastiana Delgado, his mother, who came from Agüimes in Gran Canaria, they came to St. Bernard. They were living in St. Bernard by 1790. And they first lived in the lower area here because, for instance, you know, those tracts of land that I showed you were in what we would call today Wood Lake, just up the bayou from Delacroix Island. But believe it or not, in those days, that land was arable. It was very productive. You know, today, it's very hard for us, knowing the situation there, to understand what it was like when our ancestors settled down there. So in any event, he was around in 1800, and he was one of the Canary Islanders who petitioned the Cabildo for relief. And I'll tell you the story. Louis Brognier de Clouet had purchased the plantation from the Marigny family that later became Poydras. That was at the very beginning of the Terrebonne St. Bernard settlement. And the Isleños had always brought their crops and the poultry to sell in the market through the Camino Real that went through Marigny's plantation. Well, Louis Brognier de Clouet objected to having these campesinos traveling through his property. So he consequently had his enslaved labor fell huge cypress trees, and he closed the road and the bayou so that they were trapped. So then they had to go through other people's properties, through the wetlands, and there they found the cimarrones, the runaway enslaved people, and they were preyed upon by those people because the situation was such that while slavery was an abomination, nevertheless, when they ran away from their plantations, then they were, in this 18th century and 19th century context, they were criminals and treated that way. So they had to steal in order to live. It was a terrible situation. So anyway, finally, the Cabildo heard the case, and they kept delaying a judgment. Finally, we were in September of 1803, and by this time, everyone knew in Louisiana that we were going to become American. So the Isleños resolved the situation, and one of them was Esteban Nunez. They decided that they just had enough of this man, this creature, and so they just promptly all gathered, burned the logs, tore down all of Brognier de Clouet's fences, burned his outbuildings, and then they built a road around the log. So that was the end of it. And then after that, Brognier de Clouet decided it was best to sell the place. That was a very wise decision on his part. And I think it's kind of interesting that Esteban was involved in that, and I think it's the first documented incident of Isleños standing up for their rights and doing what they had to do to protect themselves and their families. So anyway, after 1803, we see that Esteban Nunez many times was the godfather of different children in the St. Bernard settlement. We found that going through the Sacramento records. And of course, that was a great compliment, you know, for someone to be, you know, to ask someone to be the godmother or godfather. So that shows the esteem in which he was held. This is his inventory from 1828, and you'll note at the end, you'll see the amount is over $10,000. That's approaching $750,000 in modern currency today. And the curious thing about this, he had been ill for some time. He was treated by Dr. Gideon Forsythe. And so about 4 months before he died, he entered into what we would call today an LLC, a corporation, with his sons and his son-in-law, who was a Saint-Germain. And what he did was to vest in this corporation as its assets the sugar mill, the grist mill, the rum mill, all the livestock, all the poultry, and also 20 slaves, 20 enslaved people. So he obviously did this so that his family would have to pay lower inheritance taxes. So here we are, 1828. You see, history repeats itself. Just a remarkable man. We don't know what he looked like. I will show you in a few minutes an image of one of his sons, who is my third great-grandfather. Here we see that there were the household enslaved people whom they kept. And so you see the names, for instance, like Enfant, Neveillon. So Enfant is a young Negro boy. But the name is obviously African. You see Benito, Neveillon. And then he is, with the children, he is a child of Rosalie. And it just never ceases to stun me to see how human beings could be given a worth, a cash value. But that's what we see here. And you know, there's no way ever to justify slavery. But one has to remember that it was part of an economy. And, you know, I think it's going to be very interesting 100 years from now or 50 years from now, as things continue to evolve, to see what people think about the oil industry and what we've done to ourselves with the oil industry. In saying that, there is, again, no way to justify slavery. It was a horrible evil. But still, I think it was interesting, and I don't know how many of you have ever seen an inventory showing a value given to human beings. So I wanted to share that with you. And by the way, when the Isleños came here, they had never seen an enslaved person. And when they saw them, they were just terrified by them. It was something that they could not fathom. But again, as someone became a planter and became wealthier, everything, unfortunately, much of the economy was driven by enslavement. So here you see it anyway. Now, this is my third great-grandfather. He is Vicente Nunez. He married Maria Serpas. And as you see, light eyes, light hair. This is another photograph of him. You see he was tall, heavy set. So anyway, he was a very, very important person, believe it or not. His brother was Lorenzo Agustin Nunez, who is one of Christy's ancestors. That's one of Sammy's ancestors. That was one of his brothers. Another one of your ancestors was another brother, Juan Antonio. A lot of us, the families, the descendants of the brothers all intermarried. So it was just like Emily Vega. I don't know how many of you knew her, but Mrs. Vega had been a hairdresser, and she'd had restaurants. And she was born Emily Nunez at Benchek, which of course is Reggio now. And she always would look at me and she'd always say, you know, Bill, I married Alex Vega because I was determined I was not going to marry a Nunez, because after all, that's all there were. So anyway, Emily was just great, great, great friend of mine. But anyway, this man, he sold for $1 the property to establish the first large courthouse for St. Bernard Parish. He did that in 1848. There were 3 courthouses on the site. The first 2 were wooden. The last one he did not, well, he only saw the first one. The other 2 he didn't. The final one on the site we knew as St. Bernard High School and later Beauregard High School. But that was a property that he donated, a son of Esteban Nunez. He also had many different farms. He was very interested in businesses. He even had coffee houses in New Orleans in the 1800s, and that was very, very profitable. And also, all of Esteban's children learned to read and write, because I've seen the handwritings of all of them. And not only did they learn to read and write Spanish, they also could read and write French. So you could see from an early time, Esteban was determined that his family would not be illiterate and that they would learn to read and write and that they would have a better lot in life, as it were. Oh. This is Maria Serpas, my third great-grandmother. It was always said that she was very, very stern, and that one of the reasons that she was so stern was that Vicente had a wicked sense of humor, which I know will surprise Christy and some of the people who have known Nunez's. So apparently it was a great, they were a paradox of sorts, but they loved each other, and she reared quite a few children, including my great-great-grandmother, who was Rosa Nunez, who married Raul Ducro, whose mother was Micaela de Armas. You know, we look at all of these French names and we think, oh, these people are French. But you dig under the surface just a little bit and you find out they're three-quarters Spanish. This is the second courthouse that was built on the site of the first courthouse that on the land that Vicente donated. And as a matter of fact, here is one of Vicente's sons. This is Lovinsky Nunez, who was a member of our police jury, and he became quite the authority on levies throughout Louisiana. Now, this is a biography. I didn't have time to get Uncle E.E.'s photograph, but I will have it as I work on this presentation. Esteve Nunez was born in 1846. He died in 1909. He was elected sheriff of St. Bernard Parish in 1879. 1879. And he died 30 years later in office. This man was utterly meticulous. He had a very large mustache. Other than that, he was very well groomed, always wore black suits, and he ultimately had a house at Parish Road and the River Road. But he would take the train all the way to Shell Beach. He would stop also for at least 2 nights every week to visit with Leon Nunez, who was called Tran, who was as tall as I am with light eyes, white hair, and always rode a white horse. He would stop with Tran because they were first cousins. So really, this man was absolutely an incredible person. He was the one, for instance, who said, we have to have a modern jail. He said we have to have a jail in Araby. He said the sheriff's deputies have to have uniforms. I mean, he really did everything he could to try to modernize it by 19th century and early 20th century standards, the police department. And he was universally beloved and respected here in St. Bernard Parish. One of his daughters I knew well. She was Aceli Modern, and his last marriage had been to Aceli Roy, whose brother had established the St. Bernard Voice. And Aceli told me, one of the things she told me about her father was that he's very, very conscious about keeping schedules, very time conscious, and that he hated pepper, and that he could not be around black pepper, that he would just sneeze to death when he got around black pepper. But anyway, he really was quite the leader, and I think it really speaks volumes that he was the sheriff of St. Bernard Parish for 30 years, and to date, no one has served longer than he. So now, am I maybe laying the groundwork to show that Sammy came from a family that had always built this community, always supported this community, and always led it? I hope I am. So here we have Sammy as an older man, and then we have Elaine as a young lady. And so now we'll begin to talk a little bit about Sammy. I found this in the newspaper. There we have Sammy with Miss Leona, his mother, and she was an Acevedo. The Acevedos had come to Tenerife from Portugal, and they came here very early on in 1779, as a matter of fact. And she was just an incredible person. Any of you who knew her, she never met a stranger, and she was just charming beyond belief. I can still see her opening the Lourdes Ball every year. I mean, she always knew how to make the best of any situation. And she was really something. Now, if we have the fellow upstairs, if we can see this clip. Before we start the clip, let me just tell you, I found this recently, and it just about brought tears to my eyes because it's a clip of Sammy as I remember him when I was a young boy. And you see his exuberance, his vitality. He had just become state senator. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1964 in a very, very difficult race. But he emerged victorious, and then he was elected to the Senate in 1969. And here you're about to see Jim Metcalf, who was one of the great journalists in 20th century New Orleans, talking about Hurricane Camille, and you see how Sammy is right in there giving leadership. Let's show the clip now.
Over 100 Louisiana lawmakers got a first-hand view today of the devastation caused by Hurricane Camille to Lower Plaquemine Parish. They had been flown in from all parts of the state, many of them from areas that had never seen firsthand a hurricane. They were flown by National Guard planes, landed at the Naval Station in Belle Chase. From there, they went to the fire station, boarded buses for their tour. This whole thing was called by the Joint Legislative Committee on Hurricanes to try to drum up support for a package of hurricane legislation that will be presented to the next legislature. We talked to State Senator Sam Nunez, who is a member of this hurricane committee.
Well, certainly to begin with, we certainly appreciative of the fact that as sub-chairman of the Legislative Hurricane Committee, we were able to get so many people on here to see the mass destruction that Hurricane Camille has caused in Lower Plaquemine Parish. Many of the legislators have told us on the bus, I'm handling one of the buses, and Representative Patty is, that they have never seen such mass destruction in their lives. And this was the purpose of getting them down here. Many people have not had the opportunity to see Lower Plaquemine Parish. We're off the beaten path, so to speak. And we attempted to get as many as we can. We're very pleased. We have over 100 legislators, which is better than almost two-thirds of the legislature down here in Plaquemine today. We attempt to present to them several packages, several pieces of legislation that can help areas not only that have happened in the past, but where the natural disasters will occur in the future.
This is Jim Metcalf, Channel 4 News.
So, here we see Sammy in 1969. You know, he grew up in Violet. His father was Sammy. Actually, we called Sammy Samito. You know, everyone I knew in my family, when they talked about Mr. Sam, and then there was Samito, who was the elected official. He had grown up in Violet and in the eastern part of St. Bernard Parish, and he lived throughout his entire life with hurricanes. Born in 1930. Not long after he was born, terrible hurricane struck. 17 years old, 1947 hurricane. Sammy was down there with his mother and father in Tookie, and they were flooded in that terrible storm. Flossie in 56, another problem. That destroyed Shell Beach and flooded Violet again. Betsy, he was elected to the state legislature by this time, and he brought Bennett Johnston down here. He called President Lyndon B. Johnson and got President Johnson on the phone. He got help for us. And then, don't you know, much to our regret, but not long before he died, he was one of the people who was in the St. Bernard courthouse, so he had to endure Katrina in 2005. So it's really something how hurricanes just punctuated his life, but he knew that people needed help and that he had to help them, and by George, he did. Well, this is a picture of the floor of the Senate of Louisiana. And I can remember going to that Senate floor. I would have to sometimes go there. For instance, one time, the Cooperative Extension Service down here told me, you know, Bill, we need to get a tourism brochure for St. Bernard Parish, and we can't get any help from the Culture, Recreation, and Tourism Office. And I said, well, I tell you what, I have to go to Baton Rouge to do some research, so while I'm there, I'll go see Senator Nunez. So lo and behold, I went on the floor of the Senate, sent a note, but from one of the runners. They brought the note up to Sammy. Next thing I know, Sammy's presiding over the Senate, 2 telephones, one in each ear, and he's doing this for me to come up. And then the next thing I know, they bring me up. He says, Bill, what you want? I said, Sammy, we want to get a tourist brochure in St. Bernard Parish. This was in 1983. And Sammy says, well, who do I have to call? And I said, we've got to call Jibby Fox at Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. He said, get her on the phone. So, so there was another telephone. He had 5 telephones, you know, at the desk. So as he was presiding over the Senate, so I dialed the number. Jibby came to the phone because I did know her. The Bienvenus were relatives of mine, Lionel Bienvenu, and Lionel had known Jibby well. And I had met her with Aunt Carrie and all. So she came to the phone, and I said, and she said, well, how are you, darling? And I said, oh, I'm fine. I said, would you please hold the phone? Senator Nunez wants to talk to you. So I handed the phone to Sammy. He says, Miss Fox, this is Senator Nunez. Hyland's going over there, and you're going to give him that grant for that tourist brochure. Isn't that right? She said, oh, yes, send him right now. So that's how we got our first Discover St. Bernard brochure. We finally put it out in 1984. But there were many other things that Sammy did. I mean, that's just one of my personal recollections. For example, this is a plaque that was recently found in the garbage in Plaquemine Parish that was brought to me by some of our Nunez cousins. And it was from the Southeast Louisiana Commercial Fishermen's Association, presented to the Honorable Samuel B. Nunez, Jr., Senator District 1, and grateful appreciation, and it goes on. Sammy was a great proponent of commercial fishing. And of course, you know, he had grown up around that. Family members were commercial fishermen. But I can also remember Sammy telling me, you know, Bill, right now you're looking at something that 30 years from now, it's going to be entirely different. 50 years from now, it may be gone. And he said this globalization of our economy is going to be the undoing of the commercial fishing as we've known it. And he said, you know, they're just going to have to keep organized. And for a long time, they did keep organized. But eventually, you know, now we find ourselves where we do. But again, I share that story with you because it shows that the man really was so tied to this community. He understood what his constituents needed, and yet he could see the future, and he could see what would happen, though he hoped it wouldn't. Another thing about Sammy, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars he brought to this district in roads, this school, so much that this man did. It's just incredible. But again, you know, now he's becoming a rather obscure figure. I remember, and I see Connie Crumhorns here, Mr. Olivier was the registrar of voters. I know you must remember him in St. Martin Parish. And the Oliviers were, again, relatives of mine distantly, and I'd come to know him because Sammy and Lou Reese had asked me to have a gathering at the family summer house in Poydras that the Ducros had. And so I said, of course I'll do that. So from that time forward, I knew Olivier, and we exchanged information about the family. Well, when Sammy was unseated and his successor was installed, within 8 months, Mr. Olivier called me, and it was always a very cordial conversation. And then finally he said, you know, Bill, I want you to know that you tell those people in St. Bernard to keep electing people like that, because the one you have in there now is our best friend. As the money is deobligated for St. Bernard, it's coming to Acadiana. So thank you. So, you know, and I'm not trying to be political, I'm just telling you what I heard and what a tragedy it was that things ended as they did with that. But anyway, Sammy was just really something. I mean, you know, for instance, he was the one who sponsored the legislation for codicil to preserve the French language in Louisiana. He sponsored legislation to preserve the Spanish presence. It was something called Codispan, which he had me write. And there were several other things that I did. And then let's see what's next. Fort Proctor. This is another wonderful story. Frank Fernandez was our first parish historian, and he had been reared at Shell Beach. And of course, the Acevedos and the Nunezes were also from Shell Beach, though they had eventually gone to Violet. So in any event, they all grew up in the shadow of this fort. It was the emblem of their community. And it's really a fascinating building. It was never completed. It was begun and brought to this level of completion in 1859, begun in 1856, never completed because the technology of war after the Civil War made the fortification obsolete. Well, Frank Fernandez kept agitating and agitating and agitating and agitating to get money to save the fort. And so finally, one thing led to another, and Frank called me, and he said, Bill, look, there's some important lady coming down from Baton Rouge, and I want you to come with us, and Sammy wants you to come on his Chris craft. It was called the Pal. He'd purchased it from Sidney Torres. And he said, we want you to come out. So I remember that day, Sandra Thompson, who of course was very close to Edwin Edwards, she was the Secretary of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. Jack Stevens was on the boat, a very young Jack Stevens, and Bert Odenay, and there were Sonny Knobloch, you know, quite a few people who had gone to school with Sammy. They were all good friends. So anyway, we get out in the boat, and we go around the fort, and Sandra was in a full-length mink coat. Now, can you imagine going to that in a full-length mink coat? This was in December of 1977. So, long story short, we finally got to Sammy's camp, and of course, Elaine was there, ever the lovely, lovely lady, such a gracious hostess. And Miss Leona was there, and Tookie was there, and they were shucking oysters, frying oysters. I mean, oysters everywhere you can imagine. Wild game, it was just a feast. So finally, Frank Fernandez is looking, and he says, well, what do we have to do, Sammy, to get Fort Proctor on the National Register of Historic Places? And so Sammy looked at Frank, he says, I'll show you. He says, Sandra, honey, come over here. So Sandra came, he said, come sit with me. So she sat in his lap. And then he says, now, Sandra, isn't that fort the most historic, beautiful fort you ever saw in your life? And he had a big smile on his face. And she said, yes, Senator Nunez. And then she said, then Sammy said, now, Sandra, you're going to have that fort on the National Register of Historic Places by June next year, aren't you, honey? Yes, Senator Nunez. And guess what? It was done. And so after that, Sammy gave us $100,000 from the state legislature because 79, we had a huge surplus with all the oil income. Gave us $100,000 seed money, and then he worked with Frank and Bennett Johnston to get another $500,000. So that's why you see that riprap around there. So, interesting story. And I know, Christy, you know I'm not making this up. You know that, don't you? Good. Because it sounds incredible, but I mean, that was just Sammy. He was great. So, anyway, of course, as time went on, he went on to do many, many things, you know, and certainly it has to be said that certainly his undoing in terms of the New Orleans people was his advocacy of gambling in New Orleans. But once again, you have to look at it this way. Where would New Orleans be today without gambling? The port is no longer what it had been. Oil and gas is no longer what it had been. So again, I think it can be said that Sammy was again having a great deal of vision of what could be in the future and something that could work. Another thing that Sammy did that most people don't realize, the state was having terrible trouble with Tom Benson over the Saints. And so who did they call to negotiate with Tom Benson? Sammy Nunez. And I tell you what, I don't know who was the worst horse trader, whether it was Sammy or Tom Benson. But guess what? We still have the Saints. So, you know, again, just many, many things. And then in 95, he was unseated. But he didn't stop, though, his commitment to the community. He served on the Board of Commissioners of the Port of New Orleans, and he was president of the Board of Commissioners. He represented St. Bernard Parish. He did other things for us. One of the things that Sammy did was to get the initial funding for us to build our multi-purpose building at the Isleño Museum Complex. And here you see him doing something that he'd done from childhood, shucking oysters. I was trying to find a photograph of Tookie shucking oysters because they were doing it together that day. That was during our festival. But, and then here you see people who are very prominent in, you know, in the history of this place. Of course, here I am in the background as usual lurking. But here is Tommy Warner, Candy O'Day, Sammy, Frank Fernandez, Charlie Constine, and Doc Bench, who was president at that point of the Isleño Society. And what had happened, Sammy had gotten us the money, but those were some of the funds that were de-obligated. So Sammy said, look, Tommy, you know, Candy, you know, Ken, we can't let that happen. We've got to help those people. And then Leroy Phillips, other people were very, you know, close to Sammy. Doc Bench was also a relative of Sammy's, because remember, well, you wouldn't know this particularly, but Sammy's father, Mr. Sam, had been a land manager for Delacroix Corporation, and he was actually Manuel Molero's first cousin. So, I mean, there were all of these connections, and having all of that, that's how we got the money back to build our multipurpose building. So he really never stopped. And then here's poor Tookie, you know, and that was a terrible loss to all of us. What a great person, you know. Tookie really was just a force of nature. And what you saw with him is what you had, and it was wonderful. And he always was a great help to all of us. We just thought the world of him. And Tootie, his wonderful wife, I can still see, we'd have Tookie making potato salad for our Isleño festival, and then Tootie making desserts. So anyway. And now we'll go to Elaine Potter Nunez. You know, she was, it's very difficult to describe. You know, people like her today just don't exist any longer for the most part. She was so quiet, yet she was always a positive presence. Very articulate, beautifully poised. She was the perfect foil to Sammy. Sammy was very down to earth, typical Isleño, no nonsense, but charming man. Elaine, though, just had that great grace and dignity. Wonderful person. I feel so fortunate to have known her. Her father was John Marshall Potter, and I was reminded he was Mr. Jack. I remember meeting him. And then her mother was Elizabeth Reese. And of course, the Reeses had come to Versailles, which was the old Delaron plantation, in the late 1800s. And there they were farmers. They particularly had orange orchards at one point, citrus orchards. And if I'd had more time in putting this together, I actually have a photograph from a publication in 1906 of the Reese farmhouse and some of the orchards. And of course, it was said that she always said she was a native of Versailles, Louisiana. And she was a native of Versailles, because what had happened is this. Denis Laurent purchased this plantation in 1799. He died in 1824. His wife, Eulalie Gerbois, died in 1832. And at the time of her death, the family sold the property to a German Jewish banker named Daniel Warburg. And so he was the one who subdivided the Delaron plantation and named it Versailles Subdivision. So it was first long lots facing the Chemin de Paris, or Parish Road. And then after the Panic of 1837, he lost a lot of money. So that's when he established a street grid in Versailles, in this part of Chalmette, that actually tied in to the street grid in downtown New Orleans. So that's why we have names like Casa Calvo, for instance, in Versailles development. But anyway, the Reeses were there very early on. And among other things, you know, most people don't realize this, but the Reeses are descendants of Claude Treme. And do you know about Claude Treme? Claude Treme had married Julie Moreau, and when he married her, he inherited her plantation. That is today Treme. And he's the one who subdivided it. He had a brickyard there, and many of the bricks that were used to build 18th century New Orleans were made on that plantation. Well, with the growth of the city in the early 1800s, Treme, and in the late 1700s, he saw that the property was going to be too valuable for, it had to be used residentially, part of the city, the expansion of the city. So what he did was to ultimately sell everything to the municipality of New Orleans, and they opened the suburb Treme. He actually moved down to the Industrial Canal and to the area around the second Ursuline convent, and there he established new brickyards. So he is the one who set the precedent for all the brickyards from Ursuline convent to the Chalmette battlefield. The Roy brickyard, for instance, was one of those brickyards. Jules Delarie had a brickyard. The Chabonnets had a brickyard. The Dacontels had a brickyard. And it's really fascinating that so much of the material that was used to build 19th century New Orleans came from the lower Ninth Ward, as we call it today, in Araby. But it was Claude Treme who started that. And then Claude Treme's grandsons, Numa and Adolphe Treme, are the ones who sold their father's plantation, which Benoit Treme, he had actually purchased part of the old Bienvenue plantation, and that is what became the LeBeau House. And I can remember, you know, going over all this research with Mr. Lou Reese, who was a dear friend of mine. I just thought the world of him. And he really helped me to kind of connect how the Reeses and Tremes were connected, because I had known that the relationship was there, but he's the one that fleshed it out for me. So anyway, some of that about the Reese family. Now here we see a very young Sammy. We're very fortunate to have this photograph. It's very blurry. Apparently it went through Katrina. But you see Elaine, Sammy, Mrs. Potter, and Mr. Potter, and that's there on Parish Road, about 1950. And Keith Potter was very kind through a mutual friend of ours, Jimmy Faust to share this with me. And then, of course, here's the Momus High School. This is where I know Sammy was an alumnus of Momus High School, which was the first public high school in St. Bernard Parish, and I believe that's where he met Elaine. And of course, the Potters had come to St. Bernard. Mr. Potter, Mr. Jack had come to St. Bernard in order to work at Sinclair Oil, and then he continued there until he retired. You know, it's very interesting about that oil refinery. There were generations of families of the same family that worked in that oil refinery. One of Sammy's really great admirers was Isabel Adams Thomas. And she was very active in the homemakers. And don't you know, Isabel's father, Isabel's husband, and her son, 3 generations of one family worked at what was then Tenneco. So anyway. And of course, this today is the Momus Center. Here you see Mr. and Mrs. Potter at a celebration. And let's see. So, and again, I want to thank Keith and Jimmy for sharing their research with me and for opening up to me. I didn't have time to get a hold of Jay Rowley. And while I'm here, you know, let me also say that now the last of the Potter siblings is deceased, because this year we did lose Betty, or Elizabeth Potter Rowley, who, again, just a lovely, beautifully poised lady. So, but now with her passing, it's really the end of an era. So I can't thank you all enough. I hope I haven't bored you. I wish that I had had more images to put into this, but I will be fleshing them out. Christy's going to get me some photographs of Tookie and Tootie. I, of course, did not mention that Sammy married a second time to Cindy Wall. I remember seeing her on the floor of the Senate. She was a page. She was my age, and it was an interesting marriage. And you know, and Cindy was always you know, very effusive and pleasant to me. So, but of course, you know, we all knew Elaine. And by the way, when Elaine died, she was the same age as Sammy. They were both born in 1930. She died in 1978. She'd had quite a battle with cancer. And you know, it was in 1978 that the Board of Colleges here in Louisiana renamed this facility Elaine P. Nunez, I think it was technical school in those days. So, you know, and she was, I mean to tell you, she was so interested in education. She admired people who were educated. And you know, one of the nice things about her, I can remember Miss Leona telling me how Elaine would put Sammy's clothing out on the bed for him every morning, including his half boots. You know, Sammy didn't wear shoes. He wore those half boots. Do you remember that, Christy? Yeah, good. So anyway, look, I hope I haven't bored you, but you could see he was really an important person in my life. I'm better for having known him, and we have a better community because of Sammy and Elaine. So thank you so much. Sure, if anyone's brave enough. By the way, as I mentioned, these were actually thrown in waste paper baskets, and I want you to take these and see to it. Sammy has a collection of things here, and so I want to see to it that these things are preserved. This is his commission when he was elected to serve as a member of the 1973 Constitutional Convention of Louisiana. When they tackled that convention, that Constitution had been promulgated in the 1920s. It was the longest Then Livaudet sold the place to Antoine Philippe de Marigny, and then Antoine Philippe de Marigny gave it to his son Pierre, who was Galvez's brother-in-law. And then what Pierre did was to keep for himself the part of the land grant that was cultivated as an indigo plantation. And everything behind that, he donated to the King of Spain. It went back 15 leagues. Yeah. And so that's how all that started. And actually the Nunezes, as I showed here, were living at Wood Lake, which is just up the bayou from Delacroix Island. I'm not showing you that on the map, but look, I'm happy you could follow as much of me as you did. Any other questions? Well, that's great.
Well, once again, we want to thank Mr. Hyland for sharing his time, talents, his wealth of knowledge with us here at Nunez Community College. And I also wanted to mention and congratulate Bill as the recipient of the 2023 Chancellor's Vision Award here at Nunez Community College. So we want to give him a round of applause for that honor. And again, we want to thank the sponsors that make this series possible: the Greater New Orleans Foundation, St. Bernard Parish Tourism Commission, and the Miro Foundation. So we want to thank them for their continued sponsorship so that we can keep this free and open to the public. So round of applause for our sponsors. And I want to thank our wonderful staff volunteers who give so generously of their time to assist with this event. David Bolero, who's here with us tonight, Jennifer O'Sullivan, and Seth Braniff, running tech. Thank you all for spending the evening with us. If you have not signed up for our email list, please do so before you leave. You can find out about upcoming lectures on our website, in our local paper, and through our email list. Save the date for our next lecture, which is Thursday, October the 12th. We are committed each year to do one lecture in partnership with the Southern Food and Beverage Museum Research Center that is here on campus. And so on Thursday, October 12th, we will have Mr. Kevin Kolb, who is a 2023 finalist for the James Beard Award on nonfiction work, who is going to be here to do a lecture on food ecosystems. We'll also have a preview of the next exhibit that is being organized upstairs in the Southern Food and Beverage Research Museum, and that will be on the history of sugar. So please plan to join us on October the 12th, and anytime that you'd like to come to campus to take part in any of the events or wonderful offerings that we have here, please do so. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us, and you all have a wonderful night. Oh, and I have to thank, of course, I'm so sorry that I forgot to mention this, Mr. Leo Murphy, who is here with us tonight from St. Bernard Parish Government Film Division. You all have asked for the last year for us to bring back the filming and sharing of these lectures. And because of this wonderful partnership, and thanks to Leo Murphy, who is here with us tonight, we will once again have that. So thank you, Leo. So we will have this available shortly to stream. It will also be available on our local government access channel, along with all the wonderful programming that Leo and Rachel Segura have there. So thank you, Leo, and you all have a wonderful night.